The warning alarm screamed through the cockpit as Jake fought with the controls of his survey shuttle. Red lights flashed everywhere, and the whole ship shook like it was being torn apart from the inside. He had been doing a routine atmospheric scan over the mountains of Seven when something in the engine failed without any warning at all. Now he was falling out of the sky with nothing but jagged peaks below him. Jake pulled hard on the flight stick and tried to angle the nose upward. The shuttle responded sluggishly, fighting him every step of the way. He was a good pilot, but no amount of skill could overcome a dead engine. All he could do was try to find a place to crash that would not kill him instantly. He spotted a relatively flat area between two mountain ridges and aimed for it. The ground came up fast, much too fast. Jake braced himself and whispered a quick prayer to whoever might be listening. Then the shuttle hit the ground with a tremendous crash that threw him forward against his restraints. Metal screamed and tore. Glass shattered. The world spun around him in a violent blur of sound and motion. Then everything went still. Jake hung in his seat for a long moment, breathing hard and checking himself for injuries. His shoulder hurt badly and there was blood running down his forehead from a cut somewhere in his hairline. But he was alive. Somehow, against all odds, he was alive. He unstrapped himself and climbed out of the ruined cockpit. The shuttle was a complete wreck. The nose was crumpled like paper, and one of the wings had torn completely off during the crash. Smoke rose from the engine compartment and sparks flickered in the exposed wiring. This ship would never fly again. Jake looked around at where he had landed. The mountains rose up on all sides, their peaks lost in gray clouds. The air was thin and cold, and patches of snow clung to the rocks despite it being what passed for summer on this world. He recognized nothing about this place, which meant he was far from his designated survey zone. Then the realization hit him like a punch to the gut. These mountains were part of the sacred nesting territory of the... He had seen the maps during his briefing before the mission. This entire region was strictly forbidden to humans under the terms of the peace treaty. No exceptions, no excuses. Any human found here could be executed on sight by law. Jake felt cold fear settle into his stomach. They were an ancient species that resembled the dragons from Earth mythology. They were massive creatures with scales and wings and breath that could melt steel. They had fought a brutal war with the Galactic Union 20 years ago, and the peace between their species was still fragile and new. Humans were only allowed on Seven at all because of careful diplomatic negotiations, and even then they were restricted to very specific areas. He had to get out of here as quickly as possible. Jake went back into the shuttle and searched through the wreckage for his emergency supplies. He found his survival kit, some food rations, a medical pack, and his emergency beacon. The beacon was damaged but still functional. He activated it and hoped that someone would pick up his signal before they found him. As he gathered his supplies, Jake heard something that made him freeze. It was a small sound, weak and pitiful, coming from somewhere outside the shuttle. It sounded like a cry of pain. Jake followed the sound to a ravine about 50 meters from the crash site. He looked down into the rocky gap and his breath caught in his throat. There, trapped under a pile of fallen stones, was a baby. The creature was small, barely the size of a large dog. Its scales were a deep red color that seemed to glow faintly in the dim light. One of its wings was bent at an unnatural angle, clearly broken or badly sprained. The baby looked up at Jake with large golden eyes filled with pain and fear, and it let out another weak cry. Jake stood at the edge of the ravine and his mind raced through his options. He knew what he should do. He should walk away and pretend he never saw this creature. Touching a young without permission was one of the worst crimes under their law. They considered their children sacred beyond measure, and any outsider who laid hands on one could expect no mercy. If he helped this baby and they found out, they would kill him without hesitation. But as he stood there looking at the small creature crying in pain, Jake found that he could not make himself walk away. He thought about his sister Emma, who had died in a shuttle accident when she was only 12 years old. He had not been there to help her. He had not been able to save her. For 15 years that failure had haunted him, and he had promised himself that he would never again stand by and watch while someone who needed help suffered alone. The baby was not human. It was not even from his species. But it was alone and hurt and scared, and Jake could not turn his back on it. He climbed down into the ravine carefully, watching his footing on the loose rocks. The baby watched him approach with wide eyes, trembling but too weak to run. Jake spoke to it in a soft and gentle voice, the same way he used to speak to frightened animals back on Earth. It took him nearly an hour to move the rocks without causing more injury to the creature. The baby cried out several times when he accidentally jostled its damaged wing, and each sound cut through Jake like a knife. But finally he lifted away the last stone and the creature was free. Jake examined the wing as gently as he could. It was not broken, but it was badly sprained and there were cuts that needed cleaning. He pulled out his medical kit and went to work. The baby flinched at first but seemed to understand that he was trying to help. It held still while he cleaned the wounds and fashioned a simple splint from materials in his survival kit. When he was finished, Jake sat back and looked at what he had done. He had just committed a crime that could cost him his life. He had touched a child, treated its injuries, interfered with their sacred young. If anyone found out, he was a dead man. The baby looked up at him and made a small chirping sound. It was not a cry of pain this time. It sounded almost like gratitude. Jake let out a long breath and made his decision. He would stay here and care for this creature until its wing healed enough for it to survive on its own. He would share his food and his shelter and his warmth. And whatever happened after that, he would face it with his head held high. He had done the right thing. That was all that mattered. Jake picked up the baby carefully and carried it back to the shelter of the ruined shuttle. The creature nestled against his chest and closed its golden eyes, finally feeling safe for the first time since its ordeal began. And somewhere in the mountains above them, ancient eyes watched from the shadows, unseen and unnoticed, waiting to see what this strange human would do next. 3 days passed on the mountain, and Jake fell into a routine of caring for the baby. He woke each morning before dawn, checked the creature's wing, changed its bandages, and prepared what little food he could share from his dwindling rations. The baby, which he had started calling Ember in his mind because of the warm glow of her red scales, followed him everywhere like a loyal puppy. On the first day, Ember had been too weak and scared to do much of anything. She had simply lain in the nest of blankets Jake made for her and watched him with those huge golden eyes. But by the second day, she was moving around more. She would chirp at Jake whenever he spoke to her, as if she understood his words and wanted to respond. By the third day, she was hobbling after him on her 3 good legs whenever he went to gather water or check on the emergency beacon. Jake found himself talking to her constantly. He told her about Earth, about the blue oceans and green forests that were so different from this cold gray world. He told her about his work as an environmental specialist, studying alien ecosystems and cataloging new species for the Galactic Union. He told her about his favorite foods and his favorite music and the small apartment he kept on a space station orbiting Mars. And late at night, when the mountain wind howled outside the broken shuttle and the cold crept in despite his best efforts, Jake told Ember about Emma. His sister had been 12 years old when she died. Their family had been traveling to a new colony world to start a fresh life, and Emma had been so excited about the adventure. She had talked non-stop about all the things she wanted to see and do. Jake was 19 at the time, old enough to have his own cabin on the transport ship, and he had been annoyed by her constant chatter. He had told her to leave him alone so he could sleep. 3 hours later, a malfunction in the ship's hull caused an explosive decompression in the passenger section. Jake's cabin was on the other side of the ship, and he survived without a scratch. Emma and their parents were not so lucky. He never even got to say goodbye. For years afterward, Jake had been haunted by guilt. If he had let Emma stay with him that night, she would have been safe. If he had been kinder, if he had been more patient, if he had just said yes when she asked to sleep in his cabin because she was nervous about space travel. But he had pushed her away, and now she was gone forever. Jake looked at Ember sleeping peacefully beside him and felt tears prick at his eyes. He could not save Emma. He could not go back and change what happened. But he could save this creature. He could make sure that at least one innocent life did not end alone and afraid on a cold mountain. On the morning of the fourth day, Jake noticed that Ember's wing was healing faster than he had expected. The swelling had gone down significantly, and she could move it without crying out in pain. In another day or two, she might be able to fly short distances. Soon, she would not need him anymore. The thought made Jake feel strangely sad. He had grown attached to the little creature, more attached than he wanted to admit. But he knew that his time here was running out. His food was almost gone. His emergency beacon was sending out a signal, which meant either human rescuers or patrols would find him eventually. He had to be ready for whatever came next. That afternoon, Jake was sitting outside the shuttle and watching Ember practice stretching her injured wing when he heard a sound that made his blood run cold. It was the beat of massive wings, dozens of them, coming from somewhere above the clouds. He looked up and saw shadows moving through the gray sky. At first there were 2, then 4, then 8, then more than he could count. The shadows descended through the clouds and revealed themselves as adult, each one as large as a small spacecraft. Their scales ranged in color from deep green to bright gold to midnight black, and their eyes burned with ancient intelligence as they circled overhead. Jake stood frozen as they descended. There were 12 of them in total, and they landed in a perfect circle around the crash site. The ground shook under the impact of their massive bodies. The air filled with the smell of smoke and something else, something that reminded Jake of hot metal and thunderstorms. Ember pressed herself against Jake's leg and made a frightened sound. He reached down and placed his hand on her head, trying to comfort her even as his own heart pounded with terror. The largest of them stepped forward. She was magnificent and terrifying in equal measure. Her scales were black as obsidian, so dark that they seemed to absorb the light around her. Golden markings traced patterns across her face and down her neck, and a crown of curved horns rose from her head like a royal diadem. Jake recognized those markings from his briefings. This was a matriarch, the highest authority in society. The matriarch fixed her burning gaze on Jake and spoke in a voice that rumbled like distant thunder. Her words were in the common trade language that both species used for communication, and each syllable carried the weight of centuries. She asked him a simple question. She asked him why a human stood in forbidden territory with one of their young. Jake swallowed hard and forced himself to stand straight. He kept his hand on Ember's head, feeling the warmth of her scales beneath his palm. He knew that his next words might be his last. They did not forgive those who violated their sacred laws, and he had violated the most sacred law of all. But Jake was not a man who lied, not even to save his own life. He looked up at the matriarch and prepared to tell her the truth about everything that had happened on this mountain. Whatever judgment she rendered, he would face it without flinching. He owed Ember that much. He owed Emma that much. He owed himself that much. Jake took a deep breath and began to speak. Jake told the matriarch everything. He explained how his shuttle had malfunctioned during a routine survey mission. He described the crash and how he had been stranded in these mountains without any way to leave. He told her about hearing a cry from the ravine, about finding the baby trapped under fallen rocks with an injured wing, and he told her about the choice he had made. He spoke clearly and without hesitation. He did not beg for mercy or make excuses for his actions. He simply told the truth and let them judge him as they saw fit. When he finished speaking, the matriarch stared at him in silence. Her golden eyes were unreadable, ancient beyond measure, filled with thoughts that no human could hope to understand. The other remained perfectly still around the circle, watching and waiting for their leader to render judgment. Then one of the warriors stepped forward. He was slightly smaller than the matriarch but still massive, with scales the color of dried blood and scars that crossed his face in jagged lines. His name was Al, and he spoke with barely contained fury in his voice. Al demanded that the human be executed immediately. He argued that Jake had defiled their sacred nesting grounds with his presence. He claimed that the human had corrupted their young by touching her without permission. He reminded the assembly that humans were not to be trusted, that they were violent and short-lived creatures who destroyed everything they touched. The peace treaty was a mistake, he said, and this human's crimes proved it. Several others rumbled in agreement. Jake could feel their hostility pressing against him like a physical weight. These were beings who remembered the war, who had lost family and friends to human weapons. Their hatred was old and deep, and Jake could not blame them for it. But the matriarch raised one massive claw and the assembly fell silent. She turned her gaze back to Jake and asked him another question. She asked him why he had helped the child when he knew the consequences. She asked him why he had risked his life for a creature that was not of his own kind. Jake thought about his answer carefully. He could have said many things. He could have talked about diplomacy and building bridges between their species. He could have spoken of duty and honor and the principles that guided his life. But in the end, he decided to tell her the simple truth. He told her that he had lost his sister when he was young. He told her that he had not been able to save Emma, and that failure had haunted him ever since. He told her that, when he saw the baby trapped and crying in pain, he could not walk away. He could not stand by and watch another innocent creature suffer when it was within his power to help. He told her that he knew the law. He knew what they did to those who violated their sacred traditions. But some things were more important than his own survival. Kindness was more important. Compassion was more important. The life of a child, any child, was worth more than his fear of death. The matriarch listened to every word. When Jake finished speaking, she was silent for a long moment. Then she gave an order that made Jake's heart freeze in his chest. She told him to step away from the child. Jake understood what she was doing. This was a test. If Ember feared him, if she shrank away from him in terror, it would prove that he had been cruel to her. But if she trusted him, if she came to him willingly, it would prove that his intentions had been pure. Jake took his hand off Ember's head and stepped backward. The baby looked up at him with confusion in her golden eyes. She did not understand why he was moving away. She made a small questioning sound that broke Jake's heart. He kept walking until there were 10 meters between them. Then he stopped and waited. Ember looked at the massive surrounding her. She looked at the matriarch with her crown of horns and her ancient eyes. She looked at Al with his scars and his hatred. Any sensible creature would have been terrified. Any sensible creature would have gone to the safety of her own kind and forgotten about the strange human who had cared for her. But Ember was not thinking about what was sensible. She was thinking about the gentle hands that had freed her from the rocks. She was thinking about the soft voice that had comforted her through cold nights. She was thinking about the warmth of sleeping beside someone who made her feel safe for the first time since she had been separated from her mother. Ember let out a cry of distress and began hobbling toward Jake as fast as her injured wing would allow. She crossed the distance between them in moments and pressed herself against his leg, looking up at him with absolute trust and devotion. She chirped at him, and the meaning was clear even without words. She had made her choice. She chose him. The circle of fell completely silent. Not a single one of them moved or spoke. Even Al, who had been so eager for blood moments ago, stood frozen with an expression that Jake could not read. The matriarch stared at Jake and the baby pressed against him. Her ancient eyes held something that might have been surprise or wonder or perhaps something even deeper. When she finally spoke again, her voice was softer than before. She said that in all her centuries of life, she had never seen anything like this. A human who risked death for a child who chose a human over her own kind. It was impossible. It went against everything she thought she knew about these short-lived creatures. And yet here it was, happening before her very eyes. The matriarch fell silent, and Jake waited to learn his fate. The silence stretched across the mountain clearing like a held breath. Jake stood with Ember pressed against his leg, surrounded by 12 of the most dangerous creatures in the galaxy. His heart pounded in his chest and his mouth was dry with fear, but he did not look away from the matriarch. Whatever happened next, he would face it standing tall. Then the matriarch did something that Jake never expected. She lowered her massive head until her snout nearly touched the ground. It was a gesture he had read about in diplomatic briefings, but never thought he would see in person. Among the lowering the head was the highest sign of respect, reserved only for those who had earned great honor through their actions. The matriarch was bowing to him. One by one, every in the circle followed her lead. Even Al, who had called for Jake's death just minutes ago, lowered his head toward the ground. The warrior's expression had changed from hatred to something else entirely. He looked shocked and confused, as if his entire understanding of the world had been turned upside down. The matriarch raised her head and spoke again. Her voice carried across the clearing with the weight of ancient authority, and every word seemed to echo off the mountain peaks around them. She told Jake that her name was, and she was the leader of the Western Nesting Grounds. She told him that the child he had saved was named, and she was granddaughter. The baby had been separated from her mother during a terrible storm 5 days ago. Search parties had looked everywhere, but they had found no trace of her. They had begun to lose hope. Then's voice grew heavy with grief. She told Jake that mother had died during the search. She had been caught in a rockslide while looking for her daughter in the northern passes. They had found her body just 2 days ago. The loss had devastated their entire community, and they had assumed that was lost as well. Jake felt his throat tighten with emotion. He looked down at the baby pressed against him and understood for the first time how much she had lost. Ember, no, had been alone and afraid, crying for a mother who would never come. If Jake had not found her, she would have died alone on that mountain. Continued speaking. She said that among there was no greater virtue than protecting the young. Children were sacred, precious beyond measure, and anyone who harmed them was considered the lowest form of life. But anyone who saved them, especially at risk to their own safety, was honored above all others. She told Jake that he had committed no crime. He had done something far greater. He had proven himself worthy of a title that had not been given to an outsider in over 1,000 years. Spoke a word in the ancient tongue. The word was, and it meant guardian of the innocent. Jake did not know how to respond. He stood in stunned silence as the meaning of her words sank in. He had expected death. He had expected judgment and punishment and pain. Instead, he was being honored by creatures who had been at war with his species just 20 years ago. Al stepped forward and Jake tensed instinctively, but the warrior did not raise a claw against him. Instead, Al spoke words of formal apology in the common trade language. He admitted that he had judged Jake unfairly. He admitted that he had let old hatreds cloud his vision and prevent him from seeing the truth. He asked for forgiveness, not just from Jake, but from who had chosen this human as her protector. Jake nodded slowly and accepted the apology. He understood where Al's hatred came from. The war had left deep scars on both sides, wounds that would take generations to heal. But healing had to start somewhere, and perhaps it could start here on this mountain with a baby and a stranded human. Spoke again. She declared that Jake would face no punishment for his actions. Instead, he would be granted something that no human had ever received before. He would be given citizenship within the sovereignty. He would be considered family to her people, with all the rights and protections that entailed. No would ever raise a claw against him, and any who did would answer to herself. Jake opened his mouth to thank her, but raised a claw to stop him. She said that there was one more thing she needed to tell him, one more tradition that applied to this situation, and what she said next would change his life forever. She spoke of an ancient custom called EV, the life bond. When someone saved a child from certain death, that child had the right to choose whether to bond with their rescuer. The bond was sacred and eternal, a connection that transcended species and culture and even death itself. If chose to bond with Jake, they would be linked for as long as both of them lived. Looked at her granddaughter with ancient eyes full of love and sorrow. She explained that the bond was not something that could be forced or commanded, had to choose freely, understanding what it meant. She would be choosing to tie herself to a human, a creature who lived such a short time compared to the. She would be choosing to share his joys and his sorrows, his triumphs and his failures. And one day, far sooner than any should have to face such things, she would have to say goodbye to him. Knelt down before and spoke to her in the tongue. The words were soft and gentle, meant only for the baby's ears. Jake did not understand them, but he could see the love in his eyes as she explained the choice that lay before her granddaughter. When she finished speaking, looked up at her grandmother for a long moment. Then she turned and looked at Jake. Stood between her grandmother and Jake, looking back and forth between them with her large golden eyes. The entire assembly of watched in silence, waiting to see what she would do. Even the mountain wind seemed to hold its breath, as if the whole world understood the importance of this moment. Jake knelt down so that he was closer to her level. He did not try to influence her decision. He did not call to her or reach out his hand. This had to be her choice, freely made, or it would mean nothing at all. He simply looked at her and let her see the truth in his eyes. Whatever she decided, he would accept it. Took a hesitant step toward. The matriarch watched her granddaughter with an expression of gentle patience, ready to welcome her back into the fold of her people. It would be the sensible choice. It would be the safe choice. Could live out her long life among her own kind, surrounded by family and tradition and everything she had ever known. But then stopped. She turned and looked at Jake again, and something shifted in her golden eyes. She remembered the gentle hands that had lifted the rocks from her broken body. She remembered the soft voice that had soothed her fears through long, cold nights. She remembered the warmth of sleeping beside someone who made her feel safe when everything else in the world had become terrifying and uncertain. Made her decision. She hobbled across the clearing toward Jake, moving as fast as her healing wing would allow. When she reached him, she did not simply press against his leg as she had done before. Instead, she rose up on her hind legs and placed her forehead against his open palm. A wave of warmth spread through Jake's body, starting from where it touched his hand and radiating outward until it filled every part of him. He gasped at the sensation, feeling something deep and ancient settle into his chest like a second heartbeat. It was the bond, the EV, forming between them in a connection that went beyond words or understanding. Chirped softly and looked up at him with eyes that now held a new depth of emotion. Jake could feel her presence in the back of his mind, a warm and constant awareness that had not been there before. She was happy. She was relieved. She was home. Rose to her full height and announced the bond to the assembly. Her voice rang out across the mountains, carrying the news to any within hearing distance. A human and a child had bonded through the ancient rite of EV. For the first time in recorded history, the two species were joined by something deeper than treaties or politics. They were joined by love. The reaction among them was mixed. Some of them looked uncertain, unsure what to make of this unprecedented event. Others seemed curious, leaning forward to get a better look at the human who had earned such an extraordinary honor. And a few, including Al, looked at Jake with something that might have been the beginning of genuine respect. Approached Jake and spoke to him directly. She told him that he was now responsible for in ways that went beyond simple guardianship. Through the bond, they would share each other's emotions and experiences. When he was happy, she would feel it. When he was sad, she would know. They were connected now, two souls bound together across the vast divide between their species. Jake nodded solemnly and promised to honor that responsibility. He would care for as if she were his own family, because in every way that mattered, she now was. The news of what happened on that mountain spread quickly through both civilizations. Within days, every major news network in the Galactic Union was running the story. A human who risked his life to save an alien child. A bond formed between species that had been enemies just a generation ago. It captured the imagination of billions and sparked conversations about what was possible when fear gave way to compassion. The sovereignty officially recognized Jake as a citizen and a member of his clan. Diplomats on both sides pointed to his story as proof that peace between their peoples could be more than just a cold truce. It could be a genuine friendship, built on mutual respect and understanding. 6 months later, Jake stood in a great hall on Earth, attending a ceremony to mark a new era of cooperation between humans and representatives from both species had gathered to sign expanded treaties and establish new programs for cultural exchange. It was the most significant diplomatic event since the end of the war. Stood beside him, now twice the size she had been when he found her. Her wing had healed completely, and her red scales gleamed under the bright lights of the hall. She drew stares from everyone present, human and alike, but she paid them no attention. Her eyes were fixed on Jake, and through their bond he could feel her pride and contentment. During a pause in the proceedings, a young boy approached Jake with wide eyes full of curiosity. The boy could not have been more than 8 years old, and he looked up at Jake, and with the innocent wonder that only children possess. The boy asked Jake a simple question. He asked why Jake had done it. Why had he risked everything to save an alien creature he had never met before? Jake looked down at the boy, then at standing faithfully by his side. He felt the warmth of their bond pulsing gently in his chest, a constant reminder of the connection they shared. He thought about Emma and the guilt he had carried for so long. He thought about the cold mountain and the small creature crying in the ravine. He thought about all the choices that had led him to this moment. Then he gave the boy his answer. He said that had been alone and hurt and scared. She had needed help and he had been there to give it. That was all that mattered, not what species she was, not what the laws said, not what might happen to him if he got caught. When someone needed help and you could provide it, you helped them. It was that simple. The boy nodded slowly, as if filing this information away for future reference. Then he thanked Jake and ran back to his parents. Across the hall, the delegation watched the exchange. Stood among them, her ancient eyes taking in everything. When Jake's words reached her ears, she lowered her head slightly in a gesture of respect that only a few people in the room understood. Jake felt a surge of emotion through his bond with. She was proud of him. She was grateful. She loved him in the pure and uncomplicated way that only a child could love, and she wanted him to know it. He placed his hand on her head and scratched the spot behind her horns that always made her chirp with pleasure. Around them, humans mingled and talked and began the slow process of becoming something more than former enemies. The future was uncertain, as all futures were, but for the first time in a long time, it felt bright. And it had all started with one simple act of kindness on a cold mountain, when a man chose compassion over fear and found a family he never expected.